Dan and Shay, the Obsessed release. Dan and Shay weren't an band that was immediately successful. They weren't an overnight sensation, but they did get a lot of attention and a lot of success with their debut album. Their first single, 19 You and Me, was incredibly successful on the charts, especially since it was their debut single, and it got them a lot of attention. But they knew going into their sophomore album that they were going to have to capitalize on all of that attention to build their career and to have like longer term success. And so they decided that they were going to look at their fans. And when they went to look at their fans, they noticed a common theme. People were always using this hashtag and just the word obsessed. They were talking about how obsessed they were with the band and their album and even just their singles. They were talking about how obsessed they were. And it was a very common theme through the large majority of the conversations about Dan and Shay and their debut album. And so Dan and Shay decided to take advantage of that. They knew that the key to success in the music industry is about being personal and about relating to fans and really making fans feel like they're a part of not only your album, but your career. And so they thought that really centering their sophomore album and their sophomore album title around the fans was the best way to build that foundation so that the fans would be really involved in Dan and Shay's career. So when the time for the announcement came, they tweeted a video which really it captured everything that they wanted to show everybody and their inspiration for the naming of this album.
I'm obsessed, man.
So as we can see, obsessed was something that was really common, and Dan and Shay really wanted to capture that. They wanted to focus this entire album release and this entire album around their fans. And this video really set the foundation for that goal. And this video also started a frenzy. People saw that video and immediately wanted to be a part of the group. They wanted to get on this bandwagon. They wanted to use this hashtag and be a part of this conversation because it was successful. They created a video using all of these tweets, and it was cool, and Dan and Shay did a great job of making people want to have this conversation and want to use this hashtag and be involved in this release and in the conversation just in general. And so people immediately started using this even more than they were in the first place. And then Dan and Shay took advantage of that, and instead of releasing just a big track list with all of the track titles, they decided to let the fans compete for the privilege of revealing track titles. So that boosted the conversation even more. Fans were doing anything they could to get Dan and Shay's attention. They were tweeting all of the time. They were always using this hashtag obsessed. They wanted to be a part of it. They wanted to release part of this album. They wanted to reveal the track titles and really be involved in this conversation. And so this built up even more hype for this album because people really felt like they were involved, and like it wasn't just another band releasing another album, but it was them releasing an album and they were a part of it. And it wasn't these strange people doing something. It was very personal, which helped build a lot of hype and a lot of conversation for this album. So the album was finally released, and we had people, big celebrities like Justin Bieber. They got their Justin's attention, and Justin was tweeting about it. And even smaller artists in the country and conversation were tweeting about it. And then normal fans obviously were tweeting about it and being a part of this conversation. Everyone wanted to be a part of this conversation, and everyone was really excited for this album because of how involved everyone was. So Dan and Shay really capitalized on that, and they did listening parties. They got people to sit down and dedicate a certain amount of time at a certain time to listen to the album and talk to them and be a part of the conversation. And that built a lot of hype because people really wanted to be a part of this. They wanted to be a part of the group and a part of the party. And so that built a lot of conversation. And of course, if you're being a part of this party, you're going to be a part of this conversation because everyone's talking about it. And that's the whole point of a listening party, is to talk about it with the group. And so it built a lot more conversation around the album and around certain songs and certain feelings and just the album in general. And then later, Dan and Shay would take a lot of this feedback and a lot of the feedback they'd later get, and they had the fans vote on their third and final single for this album. And a lot of the song options and the opinions they got for that vote later came from these conversations that they had at the listening parties. And just in the first week of the album, they really listened to the fans and what the fans' were immediate reactions were. And so that really gained a lot of attention for Dan and Shay. And all of this attention ended up paying off a lot because their album, Obsessed, debuted at number 8 on the Billboard Top 200, which is really huge for a group of their caliber. They were new and they hadn't really had that success to start with their debut album. So the fact that their sophomore album debuted so high on that list really goes to show how successful this campaign was and how much attention they got from this campaign. And they sold 33,000 album equivalent units, which just means that whether it was streaming or buying individual singles or buying the whole album, they sold the equivalent of 33 albums, which is really big in this music market right now, where people aren't really buying albums or singles even, or spending any money on music. They're kind of just streaming or listening on whatever platforms they prefer to listen on. So having that much sales in its first week is a really good sign. Their lead single from this album, From the Ground Up, entered the top 50 of Billboard's Hot 100, which is really good. Country music really struggles to have that kind of success on these all-inclusive charts. And so reaching the top 50 in a chart like that is a really good sign for Dan and Shay. And their first 2 singles, From the Ground Up and How Not To, both reached number 1 on Billboard's Country Airplay chart, which just goes to show how much attention they got. Like, yes, they got a lot of attention from the world, and that was shown from their success on the Hot 100 charts. But more importantly, they got a ton of success and attention in their individual market, the country music. They got a lot of attention, and country fans were dying to listen to this music. They were obsessed with this album, and they really were invested in it. They loved this album. They felt like they were a part of this release and a part of the success of this album, so they were always calling into radio stations asking for songs to be played, which is a huge reason that it did so well both of these singles did so well on these charts. So overall, this was a very successful campaign. Dan and Shay did an excellent job of taking advantage of the conversation that was already happening and getting fans involved in the release and the campaign. And while they could have done a few things differently or a few things better, overall, it was very successful. However, they could have um, gotten fans slightly more involved, especially with the countdown to album week. They really focused a lot of their attention on, the announcement and on the announcements of the track titles, and they kind of lacked in the countdown towards the album release. And I think that killed some of the momentum they had, but I think they did such a good job at the beginning of it that it didn't kill it as much as it could have. But they definitely could have taken more advantage of the conversation. And they also waited quite a while to announce the Obsessed tour, and they would have been more successful. That tour probably would have sold more tickets if they had announced the tour while all of this conversation was going on, either with the album announcement or with the album itself, or sometime in between that. If they had really taken advantage of the conversation that was going on, I think the tour would have sold a lot more than it did. But overall, Dan and Shay did a really good job of capitalizing and taking advantage of what was already going on. And their album did really well in looking back at that and seeing everything. Their album did really well. And in the future, they just released their third album, and that album has been incredibly successful, even more successful than this. So not only did they get immediate success for this album, but they really built a really good foundation of fans and a community around their band, which they will continue to build on in the future with future albums and future tours, and they really set themselves up for success for their career.